Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
Hi, I'm John Mitchinson.
And I'm Andy Miller from the Backlisted podcast. Now, people always ask us how we read so many books for this show.
It's hard to talk about books if you haven't read them. We spent hours squinting at the pages of the books we have to read for our show, so we know the importance of good light. And the Serious Readers HD Light has transformed how we read.
It replicates daylight, making every word crystal clear and reducing eye strain so we can read for longer.
For £150 off and free UK delivery of a Serious Readers HD Light, go to seriousreaders.com/backlisted and use the discount code BACK, B-A-C-K.
That's seriousreaders.com/backlisted with the code BACK. And even better, there's a 30-day risk-free trial.
Now, on with the show. Hello and welcome to Backlisted, the podcast which gives new life to old books. The book featured in today's show is What Remains, the recently published collected poems of the German-born philosopher Hannah Arendt. I'm John Mitchinson, the publisher at Boundless.
And I'm Andy Miller, the author of The Year of Reading Dangerously, and regular listeners will spot that I have a cold today, so I apologise for that. Hopefully it won't spoil your enjoyment too much. And today we welcome two new guests to Backlisted. Elif Shafak, hello.
Hi.
Welcome. Lyndsey Stonebridge, hello.
Welcome,
We
Lyndsey.
are very, very delighted to have you here. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Elif Shafak is an award-winning British-Turkish novelist and storyteller. This is weird, isn't it, actually doing this sitting next to the person who it's about. Did you know that? I
I could just leave the room.
Yeah. She has published 21 books, 13 of which are novels, and her books have been translated into 58 languages. The Island of Missing Trees was a finalist for the Costa Award, British Book Awards, RSL Ondaatje Prize, and Women's Prize for Fiction, and was a Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick. 10 minutes 38 seconds in This Strange World was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and RSL Ondaatje Prize, and was Blackwell's Book of the Year. The 40 Rules of Love was chosen by the BBC among the 100 novels that shaped our world. I like thinking this is the first time Elif's ever heard any of this. Elif holds a PhD in political science and is an honorary fellow at St Anne's College, Oxford University. She is a fellow and a vice president of the Royal Society of Literature and has been chosen by BBC's 100 Most Inspiring and Influential Women. Elif is a prominent advocate for women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and freedom of expression. In 2024, she was awarded the British Academy President's Medal for, quote, her excellent body of work, which demonstrates an incredible intercultural range. Listeners, what's she doing here? She's massively overqualified for Backlisted, but we are so glad to see you. Thank you. Thank you. Lyndsey Stonebridge is a professor of humanities and human rights at the University of Birmingham, UK. She is the author of Placeless People, Writing, Rights and Refugees, winner of the Modernist Studies Association Book Prize and a Choice Outstanding Academic title, The Judicial Imagination, Writing After Nuremberg, which won the British Academy Rosemary Crawshay Prize for English Literature, and the essay collection Writing and Writing, that's Writing and Writing, Literature in the Age of Human Rights. We are free to change the world. Hannah Arendt's Lessons in Love and Disobedience was published by Jonathan Cape and the Hogarth Press in January 2024. Lyndsey is currently working on a new book, Old Women, A History of Our Future. That's a good title.
That is a really great title.
Was that greeted warmly?
Yes, it was, but I now have to get old and write the book. So.
Oh, okay. And that's going to be published in 2027. Goodness, you're announcing that early.
Yeah, that was my publisher's decision. I think they were worried I might die or get ill before I finished it. So this is going to be a quick book.
Okay. She is a regular media commentator and broadcaster. She lives in London. And similarly, we are surprised and delighted you're here, Lyndsey. Thank you so much.
It's great to be here.
Fantastic. Well, on to the book, What Remains? The Collected Poems of Hannah Arendt, published for the first time in March 2025 by Liverite Publishing in New York, in a dual language text, edited and translated from the German by Samantha Rose Hill with Genesi Grill. So Hannah Arendt is best known as one of the 20th century's most famous public intellectuals, responsible for a string of challenging philosophical works, which include The Origins of Totalitarianism, The Human Condition, On Revolution, On Violence, and Men in Dark Times. Her work remains influential today for its powerful defense of and investigation into human freedom and its unflinching contemplation of our capacity for violence and evil. Nowhere was this more evident than in her coverage of the Adolf Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, serialized in 5 editions of The New Yorker. Her presentation of Eichmann as a self-serving bureaucrat rather than a genocidal monster led to her most famous catchphrase, the banality of evil. Probably revisit that later, but also alienated her from many of her fellow Jewish friends who saw the articles and resulting book as an attack on the state of Israel and an insult to the memory of the Holocaust victims.
The poems, undiscovered until 2011, 26 years after Arendt died, reveal a different, scrupulous, private person, influenced by Emily Dickinson, Rainer Maria Rilke, and Robert Lowell, and a friend W.H. Auden and Randall Jarrell. Arendt marked out the key moments of her life with poetry, and it played a crucial role in her sense of what it meant to be a thinking person. I'd like to appeal to long-time listeners of Backlisted and say nothing is ever wasted. We learnt how to pronounce Randall Jarrell about 8 years ago, and we have yet to forget it. Not Randall Jarrell, it's Randall Jarrell. Yeah. As we hope to show over the next hour, Arendt's poetry offers a fresh and interesting perspective on the rest of her work. But first, here's a message from our sponsors.
The new McCrispy strip is here. Dip approved by ketchup, tangy barbecue, honey mustard, Sprite, McFlurry, Big Mac sauce, double dipped in buffalo and ranch, more ranch, and creamy chili McCrispy strip dip. Now at McDonald's. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
And we're back. And before we start on the main course, it's a good moment to mention that we'll be picking up elements of today's discussion in next week's Locklisted, our show for patrons. You can subscribe for that at patreon.com/backlisted. And 5 years of superior book, film and music chat, plus ad-free early versions of the main show, will be yours.
Right, to business. We always ask this question first, and I suspect we'll get particularly deep and interesting answers today. Elif, when did you first become aware of the work of Hannah Arendt?
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to have this conversation together. I have started reading Hannah Arendt's work in my early 20s. I was in Turkey, and I was a student of political science, so that brought me into her work. But to be honest, it was, for me personally, Walter Benjamin who connected me to Hannah Arendt. And after that, I started reading her work almost with hunger. There are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, her work about the dangers of apathy and numbness spoke very deeply, for me. I think when you're a novelist, when you're a storyteller, you're very connected to the idea of empathy, right? We don't want a society in which we're atomized individuals. And I think Hannah Arendt was warning us against that. In my opinion, literature is the antidote to numbness. I was very interested in her relation or friendship with Walter Benjamin. The very fact that she was inspired by poets from Rilke to Goethe to Bertolt Brecht, So all these interdisciplinary conversations that shaped her thinking spoke to me deeply. As time went by, as the country where I come from went backwards, and populist authoritarianism became stronger, I became interested in Hannah Arendt for different reasons. I started reading her work on totalitarianism. And as years went by, her voice as an exile, as a refugee, she says, we refugees, we don't like to be called refugees. Yeah. But the way she deals with identity, multiple belongings, there's a melancholy to her, perhaps existence. She has left a big part of herself behind. So on so many levels, I think Hannah Arendt speaks to me. But for me personally, after all these years of reading about her political thinking, her as a public intellectual, to discover her poetic voice was an amazing delight.
Yes, we should say this might be the newest, technically speaking, the newest book we've ever featured on Backlisted.
It's true.
Because it was only published
really an
about
old book.
3 or 4 months ago, wasn't it? But it seemed such a good way to open up various conversations about Arendt. Exactly as you suggest. So you have to all intents and purposes, you have a lifetime's relationship
I
with
think so.
Arendt.
I really, really think so, yeah.
Lyndsey, similar question to you.
Actually,
You've written about Arendt. Your book is wonderful, has done very well, very successful. But when did you first encounter her work?
it's a very similar story to yours, actually. I was reading Arendt in the 1980s, and I was a postgraduate student, and I was working on feminism and psychoanalysis. And Arendt wasn't being read in those circles in the 80s. She wasn't popular. Partly, the left didn't like her. Partly, she wasn't feminist enough. So I was immersed in post-structuralist theory and Jacques Lacan saying, the femme n'existe pas, women do not. And I somehow stumbled upon the human condition. And I'd never read anything like this before in my life. I didn't know whether it was philosophy or political science or poetry. And interestingly, it was the passage about storytelling. There's this beautiful passage in The Human Condition where she talks about the great storybook of mankind, where we're all in a world together writing stories. But then she says, and it's beautiful, she says, but we're not in control of those stories. What happens, the storytelling kind of happens behind our back. So it's a sense of a network of stories that were making the world. And all the stuff in the 80s was very much about critique and being quite cool and into things. But this wasn't. So I kind of treasured it and kept it quiet. And then very much, I worked on, as we turned into the 20th century, I started working on exile, statelessness, the return of totalitarianism. So it was the Arendt of Origins and the Arendt of We Refugees and Revolution that I became interested in. But I'll never forget reading this passage from The Human Condition, going, yes, and in my early 20s. It was comforting and challenging. And the writing was like Elif. I mean, of course she's a poet. I mean, the writing in Human Condition is, every time I read that book, it's like I've never read anything like this before. I've never read this book before. And I've read it about 5 times.
Yes.
That's
it continues to.
Exactly.
Yes.
Because of the language.
Very interesting, isn't it? All sorts of books, but particularly with Arendt, as I see it, the way the book, her work simultaneously seems to speak of different things at different moments. But actually, if we see it in the overview of it, it's all one thing. It's all one, the relationship between thought and freedom seems to me a recurring trope of the essays, the books, the poetry, whatever. John?
So I first encountered her almost in a sort of... almost by accident, because I was doing a course, a philosophy course at Auckland University, and there was an existentialism module, which was the thing I was really excited about, because, I'd read Camus and such, and I thought I kind of already had a bit of an inside track on it. And then the astonishing thing is that she wasn't mentioned in that course at all. Husserl was taught and Heidegger was taught. Now, the connecting, if you know anything about Hannah Arendt, is the connecting person there is Husserl's top student, is Heidegger, and also teaches Karl Jaspers, who became best friends with Hannah Arendt, and as we now discover, to our shock and horror, certainly wasn't known in the early 80s when I was at university. I don't know when it was the affair, the love affair between Hannah Arendt and Martin Heidegger it comes out. So I discovered her kind of by accident. I was reading a New Yorker piece. And I then got really excited that she'd actually written a whole book on totalitarianism and what went wrong with existentialism, which is the thing we all want to say. These guys seem pretty cool, but hey, hang on. Heidegger was actually a Nazi, actually joined the party, and Sartre, for all his brilliance, I think by that stage, certainly a lot of the women I knew were kind of urging me to read A Second Sex, which I did, and said, the whole point really is that he was another controlling male, and Simone de Beauvoir was the really interesting thinker. So at that point, I became really curious about Hannah Arendt.
Before we move on to a kind of deeper discussion of Arendt, let's talk about the book, the poetry gathered in What Remains. Elif, I'll come to you in a minute, but Lyndsey, I know, how long ago did you read these poems? They're not new to you, are they, in the same way?
No, I mean,
with your research.
Yeah, they've been known about since the 80s, since the archive went to the Library of Congress. There were some translations that Elizabeth Young Broyle did in her magisterial biography, Hannah Arendt, For Love of the World. They weren't particularly good translations. So they have been around, but when Arendt is taught in universities, it's usually in political science departments or political theory. And there's kind of reluctance to see her as a writer and a poet. And then there are people who come at the other end who are kind of like, well, actually, what's really the reason people are always saying, well, she's not very systematic and she's incoherent. And you think she's not incoherent; she's a poetic writer.
Yes, presumably those departments are reluctant and perhaps less well equipped to deal with her as a stylist.
Yeah.
Right. So the style in which she expresses herself. Yeah. So you were familiar with some of the poems, or you'd read the poems. So it's a significant moment, the bringing together of all her poetry. Elif, what was your first response to the poetry? We should just explain that most of the poems were written in two batches, weren't they? Yeah. In the 1920s and the 1940s to 50s. And that Arendt carried them with her on her various travels. They clearly meant a lot to her. We don't know in what way, we can speculate in what ways, but she kept them close. Did you recognise the Arendt that you had spent all those years reading in the poetry?
I did, actually, and if we can dwell upon, the word we used earlier, she did carry these poems with herself during her journeys, but these are not like light travels we're talking about. This is like risking her life. Yeah. She does not know whether she's going to wake up tomorrow and see another day. She's losing her friends, like the death of Walter Benjamin. She's looking for the graves of her friends. So this amazing, the horrors of the uncertainty, Holocaust ongoing. During all those ordeals, trials, the fact that she hung on to these poems, and I'd love to ask Lyndsey about this. I have a feeling there might be more poems that were lost in between. So we have these two chunks, but what was going on in between? Because it doesn't feel like she ever stopped writing. Yes. And to me, it feels like there's such vulnerability, tenderness, gentleness. I think one of the poems is called Intimate Tenderness. In these poems. So on the one hand, you have this very strong figure, public intellectual, speaker who has dealt with so much, including sometimes criticism, unfair criticism, from people on her side, because they misunderstood what she was saying with the banality of evil. So she really dealt with a lot. But on the other hand, having this very personal, intimate voice, I think to me that was important. If I may add one quick thing, I think Hannah Arendt is the kind of intellectual who doesn't like to be behind closed doors like an ivory tower, atomized disciplines. She's always much more fluid than that. And that's why she makes this distinction between Socrates and Plato, doesn't she? So the kind of intellectual who's engaged in the conversations of today. And in that sense, perhaps it is not surprising that she has such a curious mind, restless mind, and she always wants to flow beyond the boundaries of that these disciplines are drawing in front of her.
And yet she didn't publish this poetry.
She didn't publish, yes. I think
so if this is of a piece with her her thought, again, I'm not asking you to speculate, but we must remember that she chose to keep these private. How do you think she would feel about the publication of them?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. She'd probably blocked the publication of them.
How do you think she would feel about being discussed on a podcast? Not that she would know what
she might have liked that.
She would have loved podcasts.
She would love podcasts.
She would love podcasts because she has this. I mean, what I love about these poems is you can see you can tell her biography through these poems, which I didn't think you'd be able to do. So the early ones are the young woman and thinker, and she's discovering what she'll later call the two-in-one conversation in your head. So thinking for Arendt is not kind of masterful reason. Thinking is just the conversations we have in our heads all the time. That is thinking. And that's what poetry is. I mean, poetry and writing are having a conversation in your head. So you read the early ones and you can sort of, I mean, she was born in Hanover. They moved to Königsberg, the centre of the Enlightenment, that little red rectangle, which is now Kaliningrad. And you can see her discovering her sense of self, her sense of thought, falling in love, falling out of love, all that, discovering Nietzsche, discovering philosophy, discovering Kant. And then there is this break. I mean, she
9
had
years of
yeah.
as far as we
And
can tell.
as Elif said, I mean, if we just spell out the exile's journey, I mean, from Königsberg, she went to Marburg, where she met Martin Heidegger and learned about philosophy. This was great news because it gave her the philosophical tools she needed to do her work. Bad news because he turned out to be a Nazi. They were
quite
lovers
controlling
and
in the
very
relation.
controlling. And after that, she moved to Berlin, and it was in Berlin that she started working for the then German Zionist organization. She had a very ambivalent relationship to Zionism, often very critical. But what she was doing, she was actually gathering material in the Prussian library to demonstrate anti-Semitism. She was a scholar and a clean skin, so no one really suspected her, except it was a librarian who turned her in, because this scholar was looking at newspapers and contemporary papers. So the librarian said, well, obviously there's something wrong with them. She was arrested, as with her mother, by the Gestapo, kept, we're not sure for how long, in a Gestapo cell, fortunately by a rookie Gestapo person who, there's an interesting story there. But they got all her papers and said, well, what's this? You're obviously writing in code. And she said, that's Greek. That's my Greek primer. Eventually free, she fled. She was freed by the Gestapo. We're not quite sure how, but she fled Germany to Czechoslovakian border. Ended up in Paris, and she was a social worker. She was working with refugee kids. She later said, I was just a social worker who read philosophy and politics in my spare time, and she was helping Jewish kids, Jewish youth, get to Palestine. Then was arrested again by the French at the beginning of the war, sent to a camp. In southwest France, in Gers, hideous conditions. When France was occupied, she fled with another group of women. The people who stayed were all murdered in Auschwitz. So everyone she was in that camp with who didn't escape were murdered. From there, she went to Marseille, did the famous hustling to get papers. She only just got papers, had to leave her mother behind at that point. She fled to Spain and then to Portugal, stopping to look at Walter Benjamin's grave on the way, which she couldn't find. Walter Benjamin had famously gone a few months ahead and committed suicide on the border. And then went to the States, became an au pair to learn English, won a refugee hosting scheme. Her story sounds quite familiar, right? Big displacement, horror. One of the first people to find out about the Holocaust. And so these poems kind of like, the life of the mind, as she'll later call it, that lived through these experiences.
Well, and exactly, thank you so much for the thing is, I called them journeys, you're quite right, through these series of exiles, she's keeping, under the most difficult circumstances, a little cache of her poetry with her all the time. John, I think we should hear one of the poems. Would you like to share one with us, and we can see?
Should we do one of the early ones? What should we do? Read it. They're all good. There's one called Weariness that I really like, which is her in her very early mode.
Then we hear that,
and which is just night falling. Birds calling a quiet lament, a song I made. Grey walls collapse to the floor, my hands grasp each other once more. I can no longer hold what I used to love. I can no longer escape what imprisons me. Everything fades. Dawn rises. Nothingness conquers me. It's just life's way. That's definitely a poem that we know that she sent to Heidegger, I think.
So how old is she when she writes that, approximately?
I mean, it's 25, we think so, in her
1920.
1920.
1919.
And what to you, Elif, what are the qualities of that writing as poetry?
You know, as Lyndsey pointed out earlier, as you keep reading these poems, you see how she changes. Certain things remain the same. I think the core is always there, even when she's quite young. But there's a shift in her style. There's perhaps a layer of melancholy that increases as years go by. For me, I think what's crucial, and maybe coming back to your earlier question, why couldn't she let go of these poems at any point, even during those trials? Because I think this was her homeland, because language is her homeland. And she says this in so many ways, that for her, motherland is the German language. And coming back to Heidegger, this very complex love affair, she says that they met in the German language. I've always thought about that. What does that mean? To meet someone and to love someone in your mother tongue or in a foreign language. But I think that gave her a sense of continuity, a center, almost like a sanctuary. She was writing these poems in German, always in German. I mean, eventually she started writing in English when she came to America. She didn't speak a word or very few words in English, like she's in her mid-30s. So she has to do a lot of learning very quickly.
And it's her third language.
And it's her third language. So she does express her political philosophy in her second or third language. But poetry, always in her mother tongue. And I find that quite interesting too.
There's a comparison there, isn't there, with an earlier refugee, that being Nabokov,
yes,
who is writing English is his third language, is it? I'm going to say Russian and French are his first two, and possibly German as well. I don't know, but he's writing. But of course, there's a radical difference in subject and style.
Sure.
Not least that Arendt doesn't have Nabokov's relish for the novel word, for the extravagant phrase. Arendt is a much more brilliant writer, controlled, plain, wants to get to the idea, to the sense. John mentioned Heidegger, Lyndsey. You were saying that, she loved a man in German. I met him in
German, yeah.
Might I speculate that perhaps she was reluctant to share these because of the troublesome reputation that Heidegger subsequently acquired?
I think that's, exactly. I mean, it's very notable when we look at the gaps. The young poetry, the time of their affair. Then there's the gap. And she starts writing poetry before she meets Heidegger again.
Yeah.
When he became a Nazi, there's a series of letters where she says, "Is it true?" And he says, "Well, yeah, I'm kind of I still got Jewish friends and I really like you." And then she just says, "That's it, I'm off, I'm out."
Yeah.
But in 1950, when she goes back to Europe and to Germany for the first time, she's moved to get in touch with him. And she writes to Mary McCarthy and says, "I really want to get back in touch with him." And Mary McCarthy gives her bad advice. She says, "You're obviously still in love with him. You must do that." Whereas my advice would have been, it's quite often tempting to go back to old boyfriends in your 40s. It's never a good idea. Stay away, love. But she didn't. And it's very notable that reading
huge risk, really, because by that, I don't suppose by 1950, she hadn't pulled the world down on her head that she did later. But she was still writing, she wrote a big thing for New York Review of Books in the early 70s on Heidegger at 80.
But she was rehabilitating his work and getting it translated. But I think it was the work. I mean, two things about this. I think on one hand, without Heidegger's thinking, and thinking is a key word here. I mean, it was Heidegger who showed that, part of existentialism is there is no ground. Yeah. There are no certainties. There's no truth. What is there? What is thinking? There is thinking. What is thinking? It's language. What is thinking at the edges of creation and freedom? Poetic language.
Poetry, yeah.
And so she says at one point, and she repeats it, she says, poetic language is not a refuge, it's a place. Poetry is not somewhere where you go to be safe. It's where you live.
Wow.
I wonder whether, as well, there was an element of... She was in love with Heidegger, it was a very significant relationship, intellectually, spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether, and I think one of the things the poetry captures, even if you know nothing about Hannah Arendt, is that intoxication of young love. And again, I'm going to speculate wildly and wonder if she carried them with her, partly in the sense of the man on the back of Caesar's chariot whispering in his ear, "Remember, Caesar, you are mortal." That there's a sense that the beauty of the purity of the feeling, of the sensation of young love is contradicted by the mess of the lives that are then gone on and led by the subject of that.
It's really complicated, isn't it, Andy? Because on the one hand, there's a kind of, in the German tradition, but not actually in the modern tradition, you'll know this from your existentialism course, what Nietzsche and Heidegger teach us is we're all strangers in the world. We're all homeless. Yeah. But what happened to Arendt's generation of refugees and migrants, similar to today, is that that existential truth becomes a historical, actual reality, truth. Yeah. So it's no longer a metaphor. So what I read in the poems is that, I mean, Arendt lived that in a way that Heidegger simply didn't. And she never forgot that either. So there's this kind of sense why she's so, and it does get us back to, people often talk about the relationship between Arendt and Heidegger. What they don't do is go and read The Human Condition, which is not only in debt to Heidegger, it totally refutes his fascism. It's a book about love. It's a book about beginning. It's a book that says, yes, it's poetry. Yes, it's language. But that doesn't mean nihilism. That doesn't mean negativity. It means the possibility for human joy. And so people are very content to slag off Arendt without actually seeing the way that she absolutely turned her back on Heidegger philosophically. I mean, she sent him a copy of that book with a poem that she didn't, which is not in here, that she didn't actually include, and said, "This is my forgiving, unforgiving book to you." He didn't acknowledge the letter and he didn't acknowledge the book. He ghosted both of them.
Heidegger seems nice, doesn't he? On the basis of this conversation.
Yeah. The thing I love about is that her commitment to truth, always trying to get to the bottom of things. She won't give up on Heidegger's work because to her it's important. The life of the mind, as you say, it becomes the thing for her that she is continually trying to triangulate what goes on in our heads with what goes on in the world and the connection between those two things. And she won't, for reasons that we might now say, because it would be politically expedient, he was a Nazi, he's a bad guy, don't have anything to do with him. Instead, what she tries to do is to preserve the good bits of his legacy, because she knows that it's important. And she knows that for the people who were in those extraordinary early classes, he taught a whole generation of German thinkers how to think, deep, proper thinking that maybe, is his contribution to 20th century philosophy.
And she also has a theory of forgiveness. Yeah. You can't have politics without forgiveness. Yeah. You can't have life without forgiveness.
Yeah, amazing.
I also wanted to ask Elif about this, because her sense of reality, and you're quite right, and why she's so important today is like, tell hard truths.
Yes.
We have to get in touch with reality. The image makers, the lies, the politics of post-truth. But what she meant by factual truth was very much about, it's very Kantian, it's about common sense with an emphasis on sense. So it's what I smell, what I see, what I feel, what I can share about that reality. And that seems to me, this is a writer's mentality. Yeah. It's not theory. It's about what it means to experience, which is such a key word in her lexicon, what it means to experience the world. And experiencing the world for Arendt is kind of ipso facto anti-totalitarian, because what totalitarianism about is making it sure that we can't experience the world together. I don't know. I mean, is that what you...
No, absolutely. It deeply resonates with me, everything you said. I mean, one thing, of course, totalitarianism can never stand is ambiguity or pluralism or multiplicity. And I think all these are very crucial for Hannah Arendt. And that's why I wish, a part of me always thinks, if she were alive today, how would she respond to this moment? I do not think she would be happy with this extreme polarization and bitter politicization. The civic space, how do we become more engaged? How do we find shared values? And what happens when we lose those shared values? These are big, big concerns for her. So I think in that sense, there's a consistency. Even when she goes back to her memories with Heidegger, I mean, she does separate the man and, of course, his awful, wrongdoings. But then his philosophy, the good things that he did, like how can we keep these conversations? Are there moments when we can separate the art from the artist, the deed from the doer? I know these are not easy questions, but I feel like she keeps asking herself these. And they're also very, very relevant questions for our time. So the ability to forgive, the ability to empathize, to try to understand why different people vote in different ways, rather than, categorize them, generalize them, and then, push them down in this mental hierarchy that we have in our minds. We would have needed her voice today.
And indeed, she was criticized, wasn't she, in her in the way she treated Eichmann.
Yes.
She refuses to cancel Eichmann.
Well, she won't
She doesn't demonize,
right?
Yeah.
Which, of course, is exactly the impulse in the modern world to push to extremes, as you say. In fact, Lyndsey, you were saying to us before we started this, which I thought was hilarious, that to some extent, Arendt's resurgence in the public realm in the last 10 years has been because of social media.
She would have been appalled. I mean, it's very, just to pick up on one thing that Leo said, I think it was very revealing to me that when I looked at, she taught at Berkeley in 1955, she taught a course called Political Science. And when you look at that course, and she's teaching to white male Californian happy students in the 1950s who haven't been touched by fascism or totalitarianism. And you look at the course and what she's teaching novels. She's teaching Faulkner, she's teaching Camus. And people, the political scientists say we should never be able to get away with that. Why is she doing that? Because fiction, literature, is the way that you can look at the world from someone else's perspective. You don't have to like that perspective. You don't even have to empathize. At one point she says, I don't really, empathy can be controlling. She's mistrustful of empathy. But what you do have to be able to do is go visiting in your imagination. And the medium for doing that for her was writing, was literature. You lose that at your peril. Going back to Eichmann, this is, of course, what Eichmann couldn't do. He couldn't hear another voice. He couldn't see another perspective. And why his language, I mean, Muriel Spark also wrote about Eichmann. She used Arendt's accounts because his language had no resonance.
Really poor metaphors, like I'm being grilled like I'm a rump steak.
Yes, and he'd make up his own cliches. And it was something, I think, profoundly, because she is a poetic thinker, there was something profoundly insulting to her about his bad language. It wasn't just bad language, it was a language without thought and resonance. And she said, this is part of the reason why he was able to eliminate other people. He could not abide a plural world.
And I think it comes back to apathy and the dangers of apathy again, because actually many thinkers, among those who survived the Holocaust, have said something similar. The opposite of evil or goodness, the opposite of goodness is not necessarily evil. The opposite of goodness can be actually numbness. The moment we become desensitized, indifferent to each other's stories, the moment we stop caring. And that's why I think she's so careful about that. When we are drawn into our own cocoons and we stop interacting, we abandon that civic space, that shared space, then democracy very, very quickly, unfortunately, declines into majoritarianism. And from majoritarianism into authoritarianism, it's a very, very short fall. So I think she does care so much about stories. And that's one of the many things I find in common between her and Walter Benjamin. I think they were both storytellers.
But it's also, going back to Andy's question, she would have hated social media because, she had this famous distinction between political life, private life, which she guarded fiercely because totalitarianism attacks private life, and social, which merges politics and private life together. And what she understood about the social, she wasn't the only one in this time, it's a very lonely place. It's not actually, it's the opposite to what it says it's going to be. And you can see this on social media, which must be one of the loneliest places on the planet right now, because people aren't expressing and sharing. They're scared. It's fear that drives through.
You can't listen on social media.
No.
It's always broadcast. So that's the thing, is that so it's never a conversation.
Exactly.
But I think we're living in an age in which we are bombarded by information. but there is very little knowledge and even less wisdom.
Yeah.
And we have to make a distinction between these three things, maybe following T.S. Eliot's advice.
Yeah.
And when I think about late 1990s, early 2000s, there was so much optimism back then. Do you remember?
Yes, I do.
And the big optimists were tech optimists. Like, if you give people information, everyone is going to become informed citizens.
Yeah.
Informed citizens are going to make, the right choices. I think Hannah Arendt would have been very aware of that distinction, that information is not knowledge. It's not wisdom, definitely. And actually, too much information, all these snippets, morsels of information, give us the illusion that we know something about everything. And we have forgotten to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Which was the beginning of philosophy,
Yeah.
Socrates.
Socrates, right?
I
And
know
we
that
don't
I know
say
nothing.
I don't know anymore.
But also, as Timothy Snyder says in his books, one of the thing in retrospect that people got wrong in the 90s, I doubt Hannah Arendt would ever have believed there was an end of history.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Right?
You're right.
The idea
No, that would have been
as Tim
deeply
Snyder
repugnant
says,
to her.
the mistake everybody made was to think, well, that's that then. But the Iron Curtains come down. We won't make that mistake again.
But that's because of this linear arc of history, that it's an illusion, this
Or
linear time.
going back to, why she said famously, I don't want anything to do with any of the intellectual business. And she'd quite often say, I'm not a philosopher. And the reason for that is she did not trust big theories. She saw what happened. I mean, once you're going to predict, she says to you, why would you do dialectics with the Holocaust? What kind of logic is that?
Yes. You say somewhere in your book that she doesn't have one of the reasons that perhaps she doesn't get taught because she doesn't have a system that is easily break down. You say her work is more like a force field. It kind of it brings in lots of interesting ideas but she's always coming back to that kind of tension between the person and people cooperating with one another. She refuses this atomization that there's that beautiful bit about the Portuguese Revolution, which I have to confess I didn't know until I read your book. I didn't know that. I knew a bit about the end of Francoism, but and the giving out of carnations, which again reminded me a little bit of as Elif just said, of the coming down of the Berlin Wall and the belief suddenly that maybe there was a possibility to have a more participative democratic state.
Yeah, but that's why I think quite a lot of the Arendtian politics now, going back to hope, is, in places like Iran, the women of Iran, which are precisely about being seen. I mean, the politics for her is about appearing in the world. It's also about courage. And the kind of counter politics now doesn't tend to be the one that's driven by big theory, or we're going to do this instead, or politicians. It does, and you know this so well from Turkey, it does happen from the ground when people actually step into the world to be seen and to take action. That's what happened in Portugal.
Yeah. Listen, we're going to take a little break. And when we come back, I'm going to be asking Elif about, amongst other things, how it feels to not write in your first language. And presumably you feel some kinship with Arendt there, but hold that thought while we hear this word from these nice people.
Finding a new job is stressful. But with Indeed, it doesn't have to be. Just fill out your Indeed profile with your skills, experience, and desired salary. The more you fill out, the better your matches will be. And hearing from hiring managers will be 2 times more likely. Relax. That's your Indeed profile sending opportunities your way. Indeed, the world can work better.
Hey, Fidelity. What's it cost to invest with the Fidelity app?
Start with as little as $1 with no account fees or trade commissions on U.S. stocks and ETFs.
That's music to my ears.
I can only talk.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. 0 account fees apply to retail brokerage accounts only. Sell order assessment fee not included. A limited number of ETFs are subject to a transaction-based service fee of $100. See full list at fidelity.com/commissions. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
Welcome back. We are discussing the poetry of Hannah Arendt, although, hands up, we've been having such an interesting discussion, we haven't talked enough about the poetry of Hannah Arendt. So we're going to do that in a moment. But Elif, I know there was a section of Arendt's writing, which is reproduced in What Remains, that you wanted to share with us as a jumping off point?
Yes, I was very intrigued by this. So there's a moment when, during an interview, after she's survived all these horrors, I think on German national TV, the journalist asks her, what remains of the Europe that you've known, that you've loved, after the turbulence and the catastrophe of wars and Holocaust. And then in her answer, she says, what remains? The language remains. I've always consciously refused to lose my mother tongue. I've always maintained a certain distance from French, which I then spoke very well as from English, which I write today. There's a tremendous difference between your mother tongue and another language. For myself, I can put it extremely simply. In German, I know a rather large part of German poetry by heart. The poems are always somehow in the back of my mind, but I can never do that again. So
Exiled from
yes,
some strand of thought which represents home. Yeah. How interesting.
Yeah, I do think about this a lot. I think some novelists are more perhaps plot-driven, others are more character-driven. And then some novelists, I think, love language just as much as poets do. I am of the latter group, For someone like me to abandon my mother tongue and to try to refine my literary voice in a third language was really like cutting off my hand, the hand that I write with. And you feel lost. You're somebody in your mother tongue, and then almost overnight you become nobody. You become a child again. You start from scratch again. So her commute between languages, but her awareness that there are things that you cannot say exactly the way you want in a foreign language. There's always a gap between the mind and the tongue, because the mind runs faster. The tongue, in its own clumsy, awkward way, tries to catch up, but doesn't quite get it. You always want to crack bitter jokes. You can't do it right. So I think she's very much aware of those gaps between the mother tongue and the foreign language.
Tell us, in your experience then, how one reaches a settlement with that.
In my experience, of course, unlike her, there came a moment in my life when I decided to write in English. My fiction, my storytelling, that's where my heart beats. I decided to do this in English, primarily because I needed freedom. Being a writer in Turkey is a very heavy experience, particularly for novelists, because novelists deal with ideas from sexuality to history to politics. Anything you touch can be offensive, and you can be put on trial. You can get in trouble in a day. So writing in English, I think, gave me an additional zone of existence, a little bit of cognitive distance where I could take a step back and feel a little bit lighter. I could, maybe you can swear better, you can say the words that you cannot say with no sense of guilt. I like that. I needed that. But I think to this day, if my writing has melancholy, longing, loss, I find these feelings still to this day easier to express in Turkish. But humor, which I love and I adore, I think compassionate humor is our oxygen. So humor, irony, and satire, I think in English, they're much easier.
God, compassionate humour. Did Arendt, was she funny, do you think?
I think she was very funny.
I think she was very funny too.
She was very funny.
I think she liked humour, no?
She loved, because she had a genuine talent for friendship. That's one of the things that comes out of the poetry, but it also comes out of the correspondence that we had. She made friends for life.
Yeah.
Was she convivial company?
I think when you were her friend. Very low. But also,
Mary McCarthy was a great friend.
Great friend,
and they had lots of parties, didn't they?
Yeah, she had New Year party.
She made a mean Negroni.
Yeah, and Campari. Some of the things she did with language were around friendship, because one of the first things she wrote in English was the essay you've already quoted, We Refugees, which is heart-wrenchingly beautiful. It's an ironic piece of fury as well. And she's writing in English with help, but some German syntax remains. So it's a beautiful essay because you actually get the sense of her language being in refugee. Yeah. Can I just read one stanza? There's a poem from
read a whole poem.
The 40s, and which captures everything that you were saying, Elif, and this sense of estrangement in language. And she's talking about exile, and she says, "This was the farewell. Many friends came with us, and whoever did not come was no longer a friend. This was the evening. Haltingly, it slowed our pace and drew our souls out the window. This was the train, measuring the country in flight and slowing as it passed through many cities. This is the arrival. Bread is no longer called bread, and wine in a foreign language changes the conversation. And it's that last line, and wine in a foreign language changes the conversation. Her last night in Berlin, her and her friends emptied out the cellar of a wine merchant who'd also had to flee.
So say it was the most drunk they'd ever been.
Yeah, and I can hear Arendt saying, so far, because she was still very young.
She's still young.
But it's that sense of bread is no longer called bread, and wine, so the kind of sense of taste, and taste linked to judgment, wine in a foreign language changes the conversation. I think she was acutely aware of that. I mean, and the other thing, her friends helped her. So, with the origins of totalitarian, she said, I wrote it in my Denglish.
Well, we are going to hear her speak in that Denglish right now, I believe. So this is from when, John?
This is from 1968. So it's from a lecture on revolution.
Okay.
Her book on revolution sort of brilliantly it compares and contrasts the American Revolution, which she thinks was successful, with the French Revolution, which famously wasn't. But she's also interested in the idea of birth and rebirth. We can all begin again, which I think every refugee must believe.
Absolutely.
Let's hear this now.
But no matter whether it is a question of birth or rebirth, decisive in these last remarks, I think, of mine, is that the line I quoted was taken from a nativity hymn. Not, of course, prophesying the birth of a divine child as the Middle Ages believed, but praising birth as such, the arrival of a new generation as a great saving event which will always salvage mankind time and again.
There you go.
Negronis all round.
And cigarettes. And smoking.
But it did make me think, I would love to have heard her read her poetry. Because I don't read German. It's always difficult, isn't it, when you're trying to read poetry? It's almost untranslatable, really.
I think Samantha Rosehill has done
an amazing job.
Could I read one of these poems and just not connect, although Lyndsey and Elif will be able to help me, but I'm not going to connect it to Arendt's life. I'm going to connect it to my life.
That's what poetry's for. She would have approved.
I'm currently living through a period of insomnia, and the worst parts for me are the passing out at about 10 o'clock and then waking up at 1 and thinking, great, no more sleep for a while.
Yeah.
So this poem spoke to me. It's called Night Song. Night Song. The days lapse away, letting our time expire. Still, the night shows us silently the same dark signs. Night must always say the same thing, always sing the same note, showing in new ways we only are what we already were. Morning light, loud and strange, breaks the dark and silent show, returning us to the colours of day with 1,000 new troubles. And yet, when the day is done, the shadows linger. On rushing rivers let us drift off to distant shores. The shadows are our home, and when we're weak and tired, in the dark womb of night we hope for comfort. We hope we can forgive all the horrors, all the grief. Our lips grow still. Silently, the day breaks.
I mean, that's pretty good in any language, right?
Yeah,
that is pretty good in any language.
That's what I
Beautiful.
thought. I found. I don't wish to.
There are. I mean,
the hairs on my arm are standing up.
I really hope that the poetry gets folded into the Arendt discourse from here on in, because I think it really does help. It helps connect all the bits together.
Yeah.
So, Lyndsey, in 2016, Hannah Arendt's On Totalitarianism became a bestseller in the US. Circumstantially, we can only speculate why that would be.
I wonder.
Right, yes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But, so this, returning to this social media thing, Arendt liked to write in an epigrammatic way, didn't she? And is that part of the reason why, superficially, her work gained some traction on social media?
Yeah, I mean, she always loved Nietzsche. Some of the earlier poems, you can see her debt to Nietzsche. Nietzsche, of course, writes epigrammatically, writes brilliant aphorisms. And I think the other thing to say about it, she has this book called her Thinking Book, where she tries out thoughts and writing, both in German and in English. And a lot of those aphorisms, those really pithy, there are no dangerous thoughts, thinking itself is dangerous. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or communist, but the person who can no longer tell the difference between reality and fantasy, etc. In 2016, people started tweeting. She has tweet-size aphorisms, and people thought, "Oh, this is great." At the same time, also, when Elif and I were starting to read Arendt, we didn't know that she was glamorous and beautiful. We just, as so much feminist history is, you find these women from nowhere, and you have to really, we have a private relation with our sisters from the 20th century, and then the images started, with the smoking and her cradling her hand and so this beautiful woman saying beautiful things that seemed to speak to our moment meant that she was circulating through the internet. But as Elif said, without actually the kind of work you need to do to read Arendt, which is to be constantly perplexed, to work with her in thinking and following those wonderful, quite often her paragraphs, very German like this, will start with a perfect sentence, aphoristic sentence, and then it will go on for another page full of qualifiers and subclauses before you can get to the end. So she's quite hard to read. And I was trained as a literature scholar. So when I teach Arendt, I do it through close reading, because that's.
And does she leave? I wondered with the poetry in the relationship to thought and the work she leaves open. To what extent do you feel the poems are finished?
That's a tough question. Some of them might, when I was reading, I felt like they might be unfinished. Perhaps she would have loved to have the opportunity to revisit them. I don't feel like she intended them to be shared publicly and discussed in the way that her work is. And yet at the same time, I fully agree. I think her poetry should be part of this conversation from now on, because she's someone who always joins the dots. This kind of interdisciplinary, intercultural thinking is at the heart of who she is. And she also always invites, I don't know if you'd agree, her readers, yes, she's very difficult to read in that sense, you're absolutely right. But also she invites us to engage in this conversation and, as you said, in this process of thinking, like, come with me, let's think together, let's take another look at this, let's not take it for granted. So I think she might have been okay with this ongoing conversation.
I mean, I think that, for me, reading the poetry, what was so interesting to me is some poems are more finished than others, but they have the quality of authentic poetry in as much as there is a lot of room for us, the reader, to walk around in those poems. So, as you say, very evocatively, the idea is she's saying, we'll think together, walk beside me, that's what I got from these poems.
And also, I think it's no accident she was an excellent teacher.
Yes.
She wasn't an excellent colleague. She hated academic institutions and only got a tenured job towards the end of her life. But she loved that process of thinking alongside with others. And I think the poems do invite that in. I do think what's very sad is one of we may be missing the poems that she wrote, if she wrote any in Paris. She was writing other things in Paris and she was very busy. So there's that bit, the bit of when she had the most direct contact with European fascism. She was living it, is missing. But what I also find heartbreaking is the last poem we have here is 1961. She's working at Chicago. And after her writing about Eichmann, after the Eichmann trial, there's not a trace of any more poems.
Yeah.
And I find that kind of heartbreaking. I mean, did she stop writing?
Could you unpack that?
Yeah, I mean, it was all, I mean, it was, I think it was a very difficult time for her. She'd gone to Jerusalem, she'd looked Eichmann as she wanted to do face to face. Before she wrote her reports up for the New Yorker, two things happened. Her husband, her second husband, who she adored, who was her four walls, had his first aneurysm stroke. And then she was in a terrible car accident in Central Park. So she wrote the Eichmann trial, I think, in a kind of fury, a late life fury. I mean, she was in her late 50s. And it all came out. And I don't think she was prepared for the backlash that she got. Yeah. She misjudged. I think it's a brilliant book, but it is a political book in the world.
And what was, in a nutshell, the nature of that backlash for our listeners who aren't up on the story?
Well, many people were upset at her, and these people are her readers. Some of them are her colleagues. I don't think she ever expected that kind of backlash from the people around her. I think they misunderstood what she was saying. She wasn't saying that, there's an Eichmann in each and every one of us. I don't think she was saying that this is very commonplace, ordinary. Actually, she's showing us how serious this is, because, yes, there are some evil people, but if you compare their numbers with the numbers of the rest of humankind, it's a small group of people we're talking about. And yet, how can these atrocities happen on such a large scale? So it doesn't answer that question. In order to answer that question, she's talking about the banality of evil. The moment we stop thinking, questioning, that's why she's so interested in Kafka, in my opinion.
Yes. Yeah.
She wants to understand bureaucracy.
Yeah.
When do we stop being individuals and just become little cogs in a huge machine and just repeat the orders? So it's actually much more serious what she's pointing at.
Also, her relationship to Kafka, Lyndsey, you talk about in your book, is as a Jewish writer as well.
Yeah.
The experience of the outsider.
The pariah.
The civilizational collapse, I think she felt that what had happened was so profound. What had happened to Western civilization was so profound. And that I think part of that she refused, as it were, to take Jewish culture out of that collapse. That she said there has been a collapse through all of civilization, including Jewish culture. And I think that she didn't ring fence the state of Israel. She was very, very critical of the way she felt it was a show trial. She felt that a lot of the witnesses who were brought up there to emote were done to make Ben Gurion's political agenda kind of more. I mean, can't say any of this without massive kind of red flags about what's happening today being waved. And I don't think she was prepared, because she was doing what she always did, which was to try and get to the truth and to try and understand how did this happen and why did it happen.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you both. Now, in his excellent introduction that John wrote, which you can all see me reading on my phone, you described, hilariously, I thought, but the banality of evil as her catchphrase.
Yeah.
And that's not wrong in terms of she wouldn't have intended it as a catchphrase.
And
how would she feel about her whole life's work being reduced to that one phrase?
She did not feel good about it.
Is that right?
Yeah. She was, I mean, in some ways she said, I wish I'd never said it, because what she was trying to say was your point, which is like, what happens when we invent political and social systems which have embedded thoughtlessness into them? Yeah. So bureaucracy be one thing, techno-feudalism would be another. The fact that these things not being, there are a few evil men, of course there are, but the rest of it's being done unthinkingly. And I think she thought that had been let loose in the world. You're quite right. It's the break in tradition. And she loved to quote Hamlet, cursed am I I ever was born to put this right. But she said, I mean, this is not without grandeur. What she really, and I think a lot of us feel like this, is that people haven't realised how much we are broken, how much our traditions and the authority of being together has been smashed to bits. So if you want to have just goodies and baddies and straightforward narratives, those are kind of totalitarian narratives in themselves.
Indeed.
She's always saying, we missed it. We missed the moment to actually see. And that's what's so upset her about the Eichmann trial. It's like, it's not enough. Of course, Jasper said to her, don't give them the kind of, they like being evil, these people. It's not like calling them evil is going to offend them. You can see this, with their characters today with their black T-shirts and their ridiculous posturing. They like it. Don't give it to them. Show them for what they are. Banal and actually stupid.
Maybe we should listen to the little bit of her at the end of the film where she's speaking, which you say is verbatim from her.
Okay,
it's not Hannah Arendt. You'll be pleased.
We've got a clip now.
It's the marvelous Barbara Sukova.
The Barbara Sukova from 2013's film Hannah Arendt. Which, even as I say, it sounds like it can't be quite right. It's like a biopic with dramatised thinking. And yet, we listened to this earlier and we thought it was rather good, didn't we?
It's not without its problems.
But
some good bits in it.
Let's hear it now.
Since Socrates and Plato, we usually call thinking to be engaged in that silent dialogue between me and myself. In refusing to be a person, Eichmann utterly surrendered that single most defining human quality, that of being able to think. And consequently, he was no longer capable of making moral judgments. This inability to think created the possibility for many ordinary men to commit evil deeds on a gigantic scale, the like of which one had never seen before. It is true. I have considered these questions in a philosophical way. The manifestation of the wind of thought is not knowledge, but the ability to tell right from wrong, beautiful from ugly. And I hope that thinking gives people the strength to prevent catastrophes in these rare moments when the chips are down.
Well, that is powerful.
It is
fair
moving.
Play.
Yes.
Elif, I want to ask you this as we're getting near to the end of our recording today. What do you feel is the most important aspect of Arendt's work to our current historical moment?
Oh, such an important question because it is happening. We are in the middle of it. It's not a theoretical, abstract question anymore. No. And I think it's all the more important that we read Hannah Arendt today carefully and discuss and bring her work into public spaces, into our conversations. She has very important things to teach us about the dangers of apathy, atomized lives. How do we stop this from becoming even worse? What I'm trying to say is democracy is much more fragile than we assumed years back. Yeah. And we all need to become engaged citizens. I have had people with good intentions telling me years ago that it was very understandable for me to be a feminist because I was Turkish. And back then, and they didn't mean this as an insult. What they were saying is, because we're Western, we don't have to worry about such things. Because back then we thought the world was divided into solid lands versus liquid lands.
Well, we put all that behind us as well.
And those solid lands in the West, you didn't have to worry about democracy, freedom of speech, minority rights or women's rights. But as Zygmunt Bauman has been telling us, we're all living in liquid times. There's no such thing as solid lands versus liquid lands. So I think Hannah Arendt's work is very, very important today and very relevant, even more so than yesterday.
Yes, okay. And presumably, Lyndsey, Arendt offers us a challenge, and we like a challenge on Backlisted, but it offers us a challenge as readers, which is to not look for the simple answer, but to I remember Tessa Hadley, John, when she was our guest, talking about Henry James. And we were talking about how a Henry James paragraph will often not seem to resolve into one meaning. And she said, yes, that's the idea.
It's called literature.
It's between the lines. It's between, the sense of contradiction, of unease is and there's something similar with that with Arendt.
There is. I mean, I absolutely agree with everything you just said, Elif. I mean, it's like, but she would be asking us to think for ourselves. So don't draw analogies. She didn't like analogies. Engage with reality in all its difficulty and face it. The other thing I'd say, which I don't think I would have said 10 years ago, is what Arendt gave me when I was writing my book and rereading her in our dark times, is the importance of love and beginning anew. And the reason I say that is because she lived and understood totalitarianism, and what it taught her was the importance of loving the world. So she says in one of these poems, this is in 53, I love the earth as if travelling to a foreign place and not other ways. And it's her embrace of the strangeness, the mystery of our lives together that she wants. And that is anti-fascist and that is anti-totalitarian.
Yes.
And that's also why we need her today. Yeah.
And that's, I'm afraid, where we must end things. Huge thanks to Elif and Lyndsey for being such wise and enlightening guides to the remarkable edifice of Hannah Arendt's life and work. Thanks also to our producer, Nikki Birch, who makes the whole thing blend seamlessly into a satisfying whole.
If you would like show notes with clips, links and suggestions for further reading for this show and the 235 that we've already recorded, please visit our website at backlisted.fm. And if you would like to buy the books discussed on this or any of our shows, visit our shop at bookshop.org and choose Backlisted as your bookshop.
And do subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/backlisted. Remember, if you subscribe at the lot listener level, you'll get 2 extra exclusive podcasts every month. The next one will feature Andy, Nikki and I talking about this show and recommending other books, films and music we've enjoyed in the previous fortnight. People who subscribe at this level also get their names read out like this. Christina Ballis, thank you. Stephen Hall-Jones, thank you.
And also, I'm saying a special thank you to Rowan Mateson, whose name I said incorrectly on the last show.
Oh, did you?
So I'm putting that right now. Rowan, thank you so much. Before we go, Lyndsey, is there anything else you would like to add about this book or the life and work of Hannah Arendt that we didn't manage to cover?
I
know
it was
it's
I'd say read her, but also I think that look, a
Where
lot
would
of
you
women
start?
in the 20th century were trying to rethink freedom.
Yeah.
Simone Weil, Simone de Beauvoir, Hannah Arendt, and we didn't pay attention to them.
Okay.
We need to stop paying attention to other notions of freedom now.
Okay, yeah. We're a quarter of a century into this benighted era. So, yes, good advice.
Which book would you start with?
I'd start with the Eichmann book because it's journalism, and then I'd go to the essays Men in Dark Times. She was a brilliant biographer. She was a brilliant life writer as well.
Elif, is there any last message you would like to leave our listeners with?
I think Hannah Arendt was a curious person. It might sound very simple, but she always kept that childish curiosity alive. And I find that very crucial, because the moment we stop asking questions, that is when things get darker. I don't think we have enough conversations across disciplines today. I'm always interested in, when a novelist, for instance, becomes drawn to physics or biology or neuroscience, or when a scientist becomes interested in film theory, or a film director becomes obsessed with poetry. Those are the moments when our minds are more nourished, nurtured. And Hannah Arendt is very open to that. She reads literature. She draws from multiple disciplines, and she's always curious, always a learner, always a listener. She also listens to people a lot. And I think we should pay attention to how she accumulates that knowledge, how she does it, as well as to what she's saying.
Perfect. I would like to thank both Lyndsey and Elif, and to a lesser extent, John Mitchinson, for joining us today. And thank you all so much for listening. if you want to buy and read this book, What Remains, the collected poems of Hannah Arendt, for once you don't have to scrub around looking for it. It is available right now to buy. So thank you, everybody, again, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Amazing.